Today on Propaganda by the Seed Shorts, we're talking composting, a topic suggested by LilSpoon78 on Instagram. So thanks for the help thinking of a good topic. But before we get into that, let's hear a promo from a former Propaganda by the Seed guest who now has their own show on the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts.
The Frontline Herbalism podcast is a show for people who love plants and care about liberation. Plant knowledge, medicine-making tips, interviews, and advice on how to skill up to strengthen collective autonomy, self-defense, and resilience to climate change, capitalism, and state violence. Find the podcast at solidarity.apothecary.org/podcast.
Today's Propaganda by the Seed Shorts topic is composting. And composting is a big enough topic that this is probably going to be a little bit longer than most shorts episodes. And it's also just going to be an intro. You could spend days and days and days learning about compost and all the intricate details. But I'm just going to try and give you a quick overview because composting is a skill that basically anybody should be able to do okay at with minimal information and minimal infrastructure, or you could spend the rest of your life getting it exactly right. And there's sort of a broad range of techniques that you could use depending on what your needs are and how much energy you want to put into it. So first off, why would you bother composting? There's several different reasons. One is just to get rid of waste material. It's a great way to do that, while at the same time cycling the nutrients in that waste material back into your garden or farm or whatever, which is great because you don't want that stuff becoming a problem somewhere else. And it also is a wonderful material to have for building soil and returning nutrients to soil. So basically what compost is it's a pile of material that is being acted on by mostly bacteria and fungi, and they're going to break it down and turn it into this mix of semi-stabilized carbon with some more volatile nutrients and a bunch of bacteria and fungi. And that's what's going to go back onto the garden or whatnot. So it's important to remember that the compost pile is alive. And like most alive things, it needs air, water, and a balanced diet of food. And what that balanced diet is a mixture of high carbon materials, and that could be wood chips, sawdust, dead leaves, dead garden weeds, crop waste, anything like that. So it's, plant material of some sort that is dead and usually like somewhat dried out, because say grass clippings that are fresh tend to be pretty high nitrogen. Then you've got a smaller amount of high nitrogen material, grass clippings, fresh green plant material, kitchen waste, animal waste. These are all high nitrogen things. And a lot of high nitrogen things also have quite a bit of water in them. So you're trying to balance all of these needs of the compost pile. And we'll kind of talk about those one at a time. So air. There's two ways to get air in a pile. One is there's several ways. One common one is by physically mixing up the pile, turning it. You can also add air by literally pumping air into the pile, But my favorite way is by just using some bulky material, something that has the texture of straw or big leaves that just kind of leaves air passages in it. That's the simplest way. And then water. Water can come from wet material going into the pile. So like kitchen waste tends to be pretty wet. Water also conveniently comes out of the sky in most places. And at least in my experience here in Maine, I've never had to add water to a compost pile. Neither have I had to worry too much about the pile getting overly waterlogged. Depending on where you live, that might not be your experience. If you have like really serious torrential rain, you might need like a little bit of a roof over your compost pile to keep it from getting either waterlogged or leaching out a bunch of nutrients. Or if you live in a very arid environment, you might have to occasionally water it or make sure it's really shaded in order to not lose too much water, something like that. But in a relatively wet, temperate environment, you don't usually need to worry about that too much, but it's something to consider. And then you've got your balance of nutrients. Much like a human diet, there's kind of a wide margin of error with this. We can think of high carbon stuff being like carbohydrates for humans, and nitrogen materials being like high protein foods for humans. And there's like, you can have a healthy diet that's high or low in protein, high or low in carbohydrates. Any sort of like really extreme mix is maybe going to be more problematic or more tricky. And there's different numbers or ratios that you hear of being ideal. Some people say like 30-1 carbon to nitrogen is the ideal ratio, or like 70% high carbon materials and 30% high nitrogen materials. Any of these numbers are not super useful because then you have to kind of know the nitrogen and carbon makeup of all the materials going into the pile. So I wouldn't stress too much about it and just kind of think more about like having a mix that's somewhere in the medium. You definitely want more carbon than nitrogen, but there's a broad margin of error, like I said. There are a bunch of different ways to make compost, and before we get into any sort of how-to details, I want to talk about 3 different methods. So you've got hot or actively managed compost, cold or static pile compost, and vermicomposting or worm composting. And all of these have different benefits and different amounts of work and infrastructure that are needed. Hot composting is very quick. It gets hot, as the name implies, and that can be great because the heat of a hot compost pile will kill weed seeds and a lot of pathogens. And so you get a compost that comes out of that process being probably the most useful. It also retains more nutrients, especially nitrogen, than the slower cold or static method. And you can kind of also tailor the amount of bacteria and fungi in that compost to exactly what you think your soil might need, potentially more than with some other methods. So I see that as being like maybe the best quality compost, and if you really want to get into it, then hot compost that is being carefully managed is a great way to go. I personally am too scatterbrained and trying to do too many things to be excited about that. So I tend to do cold or static composting, where you basically just carefully build a pile and then let it do its thing. And it takes much longer, and tends to be more fungally dominated compost. But that's fine for what I'm doing. And I'm probably losing some nitrogen that would have been nice to get back into the soil, but because I'm growing primarily perennials and they don't have really high nitrogen needs, and I'm utilizing urine to kind of make up for that lost nitrogen, it works great for me. And then vermicomposting, worm composting is not something I know a huge amount about, but does make a nice quality compost and works well on a really small scale. Both static pile and actively managed compost piles kind of need a significant amount of material to work well, and vermicomposting can be done on a teeny tiny scale if that's the scale that is best for you. So now I'm going to mostly just kind of walk you through how my preferred method of composting, which is the static pile. First, I'll talk a little bit about what you can compost. I pretty much compost basically anything that was ever alive. I think it should compost perfectly fine. The things that I want to keep out of my compost pile are trash, especially plastic stuff. The most of the plastic that manages to sneak in there are things like stickers on banana peels, and then they're just annoying to get out later when you're spreading the compost. Really chunky wood takes too long to compost to want that in the regular compost pile. I'll talk more about that later. Pet waste is gross and has quite a bit of potential for pathogens being in it, so we don't really want that in the compost. That can get kind of composted separately with the chunky wood. And then diseased or insect damage material. Some of that stuff is okay to compost, but for the most part, I try and keep that out of the compost because a lot of the spores of plant diseases or insect damaged fruit especially can be the inoculum for next year's pest or disease problem. So I want that to go somewhere else. A lot of diseased plant material around here we just burn in a bonfire because it's convenient and fun to have a fire once in a while. And insect damaged or diseased fruit, like the peaches covered in brown rot or whatever, we have a particular bucket with a lid that it goes in there, and then I dump it in a commercial compost collection point where it will go and be actively composted. You can, if you don't have access to something like that, this stuff you can also bury just underneath a good 6 to 12 inches of soil, and that will allow it to compost without any real chance of those spores making it back up to the surface. A lot of people don't like to compost meat, dairy, bones, and this is mostly because these things can definitely attract animals that might want to dig through your compost to eat that stuff. I do compost all those things, and I think it's fine, but we have compost bins that are somewhat animal resistant, and if an animal gets in there once in a while, it's not that big a deal. Our bins are certainly animal resistant enough to keep our dogs out of there, because I wouldn't want our dogs getting in and eating anything out of there. But occasionally, if, a rodent snuck in, or we've definitely had crows dipping into a compost, I don't see that as being too much of a problem. And it's nice to be able to recapture some of the nutrients in stuff like meat, dairy, etc. Bones. Bones are great sources of phosphorus and calcium and other stuff that is really nice to have in compost. And a case in point, I one time picked up a roadkill deer, and about half the meat was good enough to eat, and half of it was just like really physically damaged by the impact of a car. And so that half got put in the compost and composted beautifully. That's a really intense source of nitrogen. So in order to balance that amount of nitrogen going into the pile, we added quite a lot of wood chips on top of that. And it didn't smell bad. There were no flies. It was perfectly good. So you definitely can compost animal material and whole animals if you need to. But it just got to have some extra consideration for keeping other animals out and making sure there's enough carbon to balance out that concentration of nitrogen. Right, so now that we've got an idea of what we're going to be composting and sort of the basics of like this compost pile is alive and needs air, water, balance of nutrients, where is the compost pile going to be? I'll start off with where it's not going to be, in a black plastic bin. I have never seen these bins work at all well for anybody, and I just don't think that they are a useful tool. There are two basic styles of compost bin that I prefer. The first one being just some wooden bays made out of pallets. If you're not composting anything that is likely to get animals in it, then they can just be kind of just pallets nailed together. You can drive some T-posts in the gaps of the pallets to give it a little extra structure, and that works great. If you're composting anything that animals might want to get into, I would probably wrap the whole thing in hardware cloth to help keep animals out. And you can also make a pretty good compost bin just by making a ring of hardware cloth held up with T-posts. I kind of like the structure of the pallet bins better, but kind of whatever works for you. Just a quick note on using pallets as a building material. Most of them are perfectly fine. You do want to keep an eye out for anything marked MB in the stamp on the pallet. Those have been treated with methyl bromide, which is pretty gnarly, so probably skip those. But HT, heat treated, or unmarked pallets are fine for project wood. And in using hundreds or maybe thousands of pallets over the decades, I have never seen an MB stamped pallet, so they're pretty rare, but something to keep an eye out for. Size is important. You want kind of a minimum of 1 cubic yard of space. That's like 3 by 3 by 3. Below that, stuff just doesn't compost as well because it has a lot of surface area and the pile tends to dry out too easily. And you want to kind of size your compost bin to the amount of material that's going in. So obviously you don't want a 1 yard compost bin for like a medium-sized farm that's going to fill that in a couple days. But that's 1 yard is a good place to start. It can also be handy to have just an open pile or an extra bin where you can throw stuff like fresh garden weeds or whatever to make sure you've always got a supply of carbon heavy material. because as I build a static pile, anytime a high nitrogen input goes into the pile, and that could be some manure from mucking out the chicken pen, or it could be a bucket of waste from the kitchen, or whatever, that stuff tends to be, it can get gross quickly, it can get flies, it can smell bad. So when that goes into the pile, I want to immediately completely cover it with something high carbon, so it's handy to have a sort of stockpile of that stuff around. So to build a static compost pile, I generally start with a base layer of wood chips. I get the wood chips by hanging a sign at the end of my driveway that says wood chips wanted, and I'm lucky that typically some wood chips show up once in a while. Something like every 6 months or a year, someone comes and brings me a bunch of wood chips. If you want to be more proactive, or if that method doesn't work for you, you can call around to local arborists, and usually you can find someone who, either for free or for a small amount of money, will bring you some wood chips. But any sort of high carbon base layer is a nice way to start the pile. It helps to sort of make a carbon filter, so that if you're putting anything gross in the pile and you get a heavy rain, it helps to keep that stuff from leaching into groundwater. Once your base layer is established, I basically am just adding various waste materials to the pile as they arise in my everyday gardening activities. Again, always making sure that anything high nitrogen gets covered in a layer of high carbon stuff. And then that builds up until the bin is full. And then it sits until it's done composting. And as long as you're putting in a wide diversity of material, some of it sort of fine texture, like small weeds, manures, kitchen waste, and some of it kind of bulky, like large weeds, stems, tree leaves, then you tend to get a good enough mix of air, water, balance of nutrients that it decays over time into a nice, rich, brown compost material that is useful for spreading on the garden. One more thing I want to talk about is humanure. Solid human waste is a perfectly good compost material, but it does require some extra thought and extra care in composting. And if this is something you're going to do, I highly recommend the Humanure Handbook. You can find it online, or you can buy a paper copy, and that will give you all the details of how to properly compost solid human waste. But I'll just go over a very quick explanation of how to do that safely in a static pile. So first would be collecting that material. Most composting outhouses use a 5-gallon bucket system, and as the waste is being collected in that 5-gallon bucket, you're then immediately covering it with sawdust or some other high carbon material. And then when the bucket gets full, it gets removed and dumped into the compost pile. And it can basically just be treated as other compost material would, but it's extra important if you're composting human waste that you cover that material immediately with a high carbon material like wood chips or leaves or what have you. And that's mostly because you don't want flies landing on that waste, potentially picking up something gross and then bringing it somewhere else. It's also really important that you keep rodents and other animals out of that compost pile, because they can also vector gross stuff out of the pile and into places that you don't want that. A additional detail is that bucket probably needs to get washed. And when you're washing it, you want that wash water to go into the pile. So you don't want to take the bucket away, wash it, and then dump the wash water on the ground, because that puts bacteria and nutrients where you don't want them. Really needs to go back into the pile where it can safely be composted. Now, if you are doing a hot compost and you are careful about measuring the temperature and making sure that the whole pile gets nice and hot for an adequate amount of time, that's going to take care of your pathogens. But if you're doing a static pile with human manure in it, it's a good practice to, once the last bucket of human manure goes on the pile and the bin is really full, then you mark that date down on the side of the pile with a paint pen or something. And you want to let that sit for a full year before you really do anything with the pile. And then typically you don't want to use that compost. It's probably safe, but just in case, you don't want to use it on like vegetable crops. So you would put it in more things like ornamental beds, orchard crops, tree crops, stuff like that, where it's not directly touching food that you would eat raw. So again, recommend the Human Manure Handbook if you want to indulge in some shit composting, but that's the very basics, just to give you an idea of what you're getting into. I had a longer Q&A question that I was working on, and I still am working on it, but it's the 30th of the month, and I want to try and get this out while it's still technically in July, so I'm just going to do this easy, short question from Gather in Olympia, Washington.
What are your thoughts on berry rakes? I've never used one, but it seems like they might be helpful for harvesting small berries like autumn olive or elderberry, but I'm worried that they're just a gimmick that won't actually work.
Berry rakes are great for low bush blueberries. I know berry rakes have been used for a really long time on that species, but I don't think they would work well for autumn olive or elderberry. And even on low bush blueberries, it lets you get a lot of berries fast, but then you do need to clean all the junk, like the little twigs and leaves that you also get with the berry rake, out. So berry rakes are only useful even on low bush blueberry if you're going to winnow the berries, which can be done very easily by just like pouring them from container to container in front of a box fan. And then there's usually some hand picking too, because there's probably some berries that weren't really ripe and you want to get those out before you process them or cook a pie or something. So great if you have access to a nice patch of low bush blueberries. There's probably other things that can be raked. I'll maybe work on lingonberry. I'll have to try that. And I have seen people successfully harvest like chamomile flowers with them. But there are some tricks for autumn olive and elderberry that are worth mentioning. And both involve freezing the berries. So the absolute best way to harvest autumn olive, in my opinion, is to wait for the first really hard freeze night and then harvest the berries very first thing in the morning. And you go out while the berries are still frozen on the branch, and you cut the whole branch off and you smack it into a big plastic tub. And the berries will just come right off the branch. And since autumn olive is like pretty invasive everywhere in North America, as far as I know, it's totally great to just like cut those branches off in order to harvest the berries, and they won't be damaged or squished because they're frozen. And then you can pour them from that tub into a cooler, and as soon as possible, put them into the freezer for storage. And if you want them to store well for a long time, it would be ideal to vacuum pack them because that makes them last really nicely in the freezer until you get around to doing something with them. Kind of the same thing for elderberries. You can cut the whole umbel, like the big structure that the berries grow on, and you can freeze that and then just shatter the berries off of it. And depending on how much little stems you can deal with or how you want to separate those out, you can use either a sieve or a colander to get the little pieces out, or winnow them in front of a fan. Both techniques work pretty well. And while you're handling them like that, ideally if they can stay frozen, so you can freeze them, smash them off of the thing, and clean them up while they're still frozen, that will preserve the berries the best, and keep them from getting squished up.